So hello and welcome to this forum on sustainability organized by CellPress. In the next hour or so, we'll discuss what we know and don't know about the impacts of plastic pollution on human and ecosystem health. The context for this discussion is provided not only by the growing recognition of the pervasiveness of plastic pollution, but also the urgent need to identify and address scientific gaps. The timeliness of this event is further underscored by the discussions surrounding a plastics treaty that is expected to be signed this year. My name is Ninad Bondre. I'm a senior sustainability editor at CellPress and consult also for our journals One Earth and Cell Report Sustainability. I also lead the organization of our forums on sustainability. Just quickly in terms of the format, my colleague Emily will briefly introduce each speaker and then invite our keynote speaker to present her thoughts. Following that, we will have a moderated panel discussion. Do send your questions via the Q&A box and we'll take them either during the discussion or following it. Oops. So before we begin, I wanted to briefly introduce our strong and growing portfolio of journals that publish on various sustainability relevant topics. I've shown here the journals that are represented by the team of organizers today, but many other journals in the portfolio are also interested in publishing content that has relevance to sustainability. Importantly, although publishing high-quality research is our core role, we are also seeking to add value and serve the community by facilitating multidisciplinary workshops and conversations. Here are some examples of things we've done in the last year or so, and today's event on plastics is a continuation of that goal. Sorry, I'm having some trouble scrolling here. But finally, I just wanted to acknowledge the intellectual and technical support of my colleagues. Emily, Camilla, and Andrea helped organize the event and provided discussion points. And Sarah, Joe, Lauren, and Julia handled the technical aspects and publicity. I also want to thank our colleague Abby, who will be posting this live on X. And with that, I would like to invite Emily to take over.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nina, for the great introduction. We have a really exciting group of panelists who are lined up today. As Nina had mentioned, kicking it off is going to be Nana Hartmann from the Technical University of Denmark. She's going to give a brief sort of big picture introduction to the topic that we're discussing. She's an environmental engineer who specialized in both ecotoxicology and also the fate of nanomaterials and microplastics in the environment. And then after her talk, we'll also broaden out to include the rest of our panel. So this includes Dr. Philip Landrigan. He's a physician, an epidemiologist, and a pediatrician who has a long history of research in public health and also championing policy change. And we're also joined by Dr. Amari Walker Franklin. She's an environmental engineer and also an analytical chemist who has studied a wide range of topics from the detection to consequences of both plastics and associated chemicals. I also wanted to mention quickly that originally we were going to be joined by Bethany Kearney-Elmroth, who unfortunately couldn't make it for personal reasons. So we will miss her insights, but I know we have a really great panel here today who not only are experts in the science, but are also pretty prolific science communicators. So we're really excited for this discussion. And with that, I think we can turn it over to Nana to get us started.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen. Do you see my screen now? Yes, great.
Yes.
Okay, super. Yes. Well, first of all, I would of course like to thank you at CellPress for organizing this event and also for inviting me here today. And I've been looking very much forward to joining the seminar and also to the discussion with my fellow panelists following my presentation. And I've been entrusted with the task of setting the stage for the panel discussion here today. So that's what I'll aim to do within the next 15 minutes or so. So most of you have probably seen this graph before, or something similar to this graph, but what it shows is obviously the global plastic production during the last 50 or 60 years. And what we've seen is that plastic production globally has expanded dramatically from the 1960s with around 5 million tons per year to present day where we're producing more than 400 million tons of plastics every year. So we live in a world where we are surrounded by plastics, and I guess that's obvious to most of us from the morning when we pick up our toothbrush to our computer headphones and to the car that we drive, that we have plastics everywhere. So it's become a very integrated part of everyday life. And for that reason, it's also very closely linked to the global economy. And what you see here now on your right is the development in the global gross domestic product, the GDP, in the same period of time. And if we combine the two, we see that they follow a very similar pattern. And what is reflected both in the plastic production but also in the global GDP is actually some major crises that have influenced global production. So if we look at the first bump that we see here, it's the 1973 oil crisis, where the oil prices went up by around 400%. The second bump on the graph that you see is the 2008 financial crisis, and the third bump is the 2002 COVID-19 pandemic. So I think we can say that from this graph, we both see the direct link between plastic production and the extraction of fossil fuels, because actually more than 90% of all plastics are produced as virgin plastics based on fossil fuel feedstock. And what this graph also illustrates really well is how engraved plastics are into our society, but also into our global economy as a whole. And one thing that is obviously also very clear is that when we produce a material, especially in the quantities in which we're producing plastics, there will be a spillover into the environment in form of plastic waste. And this is practically unavoidable. And this has resulted in a huge and very visible issue of global plastic pollution. So we can say that plastic litter in the environment, it spans over several orders of magnitude in size. So we have the larger macroplastics, or maybe even what we can call megaplastics, so the really big pieces of plastics that we see out in the environment. And then down to the smaller sizes of plastics, which include the micro and nanoplastics that are invisible to the naked eye. But when it comes to defining plastic litter, I'm not going to go into the details here about the definitions and classifications as such, but I just want to point out one thing that I think is really important to this topic and this debate is that it's actually about the definition of what is plastic, and that's also connected to regulation. It's also connected to the upcoming UN Plastic Treaty. So what do we actually define as being a plastic? Because plastics are made from polymers, and polymers, they span from natural polymers, which can be modified, to purely synthetic polymers. So it kind of poses the question of how synthetic does a material have to be before we should classify it as a plastic. So I think that that's really, really important. And I don't know if any of the listeners here today are involved in the plastic treaty work. But if you are, then maybe you have also heard of PPP, which in the context of the plastic treaty stands for primary plastic polymers. And there are some discussions ongoing about how to define that. In my following slides, I'll be talking about a lot of other Ps. So I'm not referring here to primary plastic polymers, but I'll be talking about other Ps. And the first of them is P for plastic pollution, obviously. Because what we do know about plastics is obviously that they are out there and they pollute our environment. The second P is P for pervasive, because we also know, and we see that very clearly, that plastics are everywhere in our environments. We see it on the beach, we see it in our rivers. And especially it can be catalyzed by a lack of efficient waste management systems. But more and more science is also showing, or it's the scientific evidence that is emerging on the presence of microplastics, but also nanoplastics. And they are detected in the deepest seas and on the highest mountains. They are also found in a lot of different environmental compartments, including lakes, and they're also now being found inside the human body. So plastics are everywhere. Plastics are pervasive. Plastics are also persistent because once they are out there in the environment, they can stay there for a very long time. And this image here is a piece of plastic which was found inside the stomach of a 6-month-old albatross back in the early 2000s. And it's believed to be a piece of bakelite from a US Navy airplane and was produced around the time of the Second World War. So maybe this plane crashed in the ocean. We don't know for sure, of course, but it could have been floating around in the ocean for about 60 years before it was swallowed by the albatross, which eventually died and was then documented in this photo. And it still seems to be in a relatively good condition here. So that's one example, but even plastics that are designed to be biodegradable can persist in the environment. And this includes bioplastics that are designed to be degradable during composting. And what you see in the graph here is actually showing how different types of bioplastics are quite easily degraded during composting. But if they should end up in seawater, for example, which you see in the bottom part of the graph, there is less optimal conditions for degradation, and they can persist much longer out there in the actual environment. So plastics are persistent. Plastics are also, plastics are also problematic. And I think I don't necessarily need to show any more images of seabirds or sea lions that have been entangled in fishing nets, because we know that hundreds of marine animals, megafauna, they ingest plastics and they get entangled in plastics. And we also know that plastics contain chemicals that are of concern to both humans and also to environmental health. And this has been highlighted by many, including the UN technical report on chemicals in plastics that came out last year, but also in the newly released report from the Norwegian Plastic Chem project, which I'll come back to later in my talk. Finally, due to the direct links to fossil fuel feedstock, plastic chemicals, and the environmental consequences of plastics, plastics are also, they can also be seen as being directly linked to the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and chemical pollution. So in my view, there is no doubt plastic pollution is pervasive, it's persistent, it's problematic, and actions to reduce plastic pollution are justified based on our current level of knowledge and understanding. There's no doubt that this is a global problem. It's a complex problem, and it requires both global and complex solutions. And one example of a current action is obviously the ongoing UN Plastic Treaty negotiations, which I really hope will have a successful outcome. And maybe that's also something that we can discuss in the panel afterwards. So scientific knowledge can support appropriate actions both now with the treaty, but also in the future. So in this second part of my presentation, I wanted to dive into the sea of microplastic research. And I call my slide here the landscape of microplastic research, but maybe I feel like maybe I should have rephrased it to seascape, because at least that's the feeling I sometimes get as a scientist working within this field of environmental effects of microplastics. I've been working within this field for the last 10 years or so. So around, I started my research in microplastics around 2013 or 2014. And here I am now in my little boat, and I'm being hit by a tsunami of scientific publications. And that's the first thing that I wanted to discuss here today. because in recent years we've seen a very sharp rise in scientific publications within the field of microplastics research in general. And here I will focus on the research into their environmental effects because that's my topic of my area of research. The graph that I'm showing you here is based on a search in Web of Science, and it shows the development in the scientific literature on the environmental effects of micro and nanoplastics since 2009. Things started to take off around, I think, 2011. When I started working in this field, so that was around 2013, 2014, I could still keep myself up to date on new studies that were coming out. But this situation has changed rapidly. And in around 2023, around 1,500 papers were published just on the ecotoxicity of micro and nanoplastics. And this translates into 6 papers being published per day, per working day, which is a lot to digest and to read. One thing that's also interesting in my view is that around 20% of all papers within this field are actually review papers. And I've even seen one example of a review of reviews. So I think that's also something to be discussed. With the rise in research, there's also been a rise in methodological developments. And again, 2011 seemed to be a point in time where things begin to take off, with many new methodological developments within all aspects of microplastic sampling, extraction, and analysis. I think there really is a great need for better methods, especially for sample preparation methods that have to be non-destructive. You have to have a good recovery. But it's also led to a complexity in instrumentation and methods. And in the future, I think we probably need to look more into standardization and harmonization to support data reliability, but also comparability across studies and different environmental matrices. Another topic where researchers are really pushing the boundaries at the moment is when it comes to nanoplastics. And analysis of nanoplastics comes with a whole new set of challenges, and that's something that we're working as a community, I think, to solve at the moment. So the status of microplastic research today is that we have a high level of complexity, and we have also a high quantity of studies being published. So the last slides of my presentation I will use to argue that information doesn't necessarily equal knowledge in this situation, and I will give a few suggestions to the way forward. So in addition to the complexity in methods, which I presented just before, there are also other factors which are bringing complexity into our data. For example, what you see here is on the top of my slide, you see a microplastic that is 1 micrometer. And on the bottom of the slide, you see another microplastic that is 1,000 nanometers. So both are microplastics, but obviously microplastics, they span over a huge variation in particle size alone. Microplastics, they also vary in polymer composition, and these are just some types of more well-known or common polymers. Now you can add to this all the plastic chemicals. So as I just mentioned before, there was a new report that came out from the PLASCAM project, which has been funded by the Norwegian Research Council and led by NTNU in Trondheim and Martin Wagner. And this project identified more than 16,000 different chemicals associated with plastic production and plastic products. More than 4,200 of these are identified as chemicals of concern based on PPG properties. And hazard data is missing for more than 10,000 of these chemicals. So this is the report. So where that leaves us is with a almost indefinite combination of different particle sizes, particle characteristics, and particle compositions. So microplastics is not a single contaminant, it includes a range of very different contaminants, and obviously we cannot test all of them. So if we look into the future, of course we can aim for more diversity in our choice of test materials, and it's also something that we see happening. So we're moving away from testing only spherical polystyrene particles that we were doing in the beginning of this research field when it was still young. So we're moving towards also testing other types of plastics, and that's what this graph shows, is this kind of diversification in polymers that are being tested. But of course, this will not alone solve the issue of generating knowledge instead of information. It also calls for, or actually, yeah, I have this one. Yeah, so calls have also been made by others that somehow we need to raise the bar for the publications within microplastics research. And in my view, that relates to a greater focus also on data reliability, including quality assurance, including quality control in our studies. It is linked to also moving away from descriptive studies, so simply reporting something that we find or something that we see or observe, but moving even more towards mechanistic understanding and hypothesis-driven research. So I think as authors, as reviewers, as editors, as publishers, it also means more careful consideration of the quality of manuscripts and how they contribute to advancing our collective knowledge on the effects of microplastics. So with that, I would just like to repeat a few of the main take-home messages from my talk. So plastic pollution, use and pollution is deeply embedded in society and in the global economy. It's intertwined with climate change, chemical pollution, and biodiversity loss, which constitutes the triple planetary crisis. Plastic pollution is pervasive, persistent, and is problematic. And I would say we have enough information at this point in time to warrant immediate action to reduce plastic pollution. Going forward in research, it's essential that we shift our focus away from descriptive studies to prioritize hypothesis-driven research aimed at gaining mechanistic understanding. So with that, I would like to say thank you for your attention, and of course open the floor for questions and give the word back to you, Emily and Ninat.
Thank you so much. That was a really, really beautiful talk. I wish we had thunderous applause here, but we'll get some virtual claps for sure. I did have one question to kind of lead things off. I really liked the theme of not equating information and knowledge. But as you mentioned, there's, thousands of publications that already exist about microplastics. So is there any way to take the existing information and turn it into some knowledge, or do you think that it's been collected under such sort of disparate conditions that it's really difficult to use it in that context?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, like what we do, because of course we have all this information out there, a lot of resources has gone into generating all this information, and we need to somehow find a way to make sense of it all. So I think, of course, there are things like, meta-analysis. You could somehow try to bring together this information in a meaningful way. I think in my view, I think something can be done and should be done. I think somehow it requires, of course, that we are quite careful with the data that goes into these type of, for example, meta-analysis, that we put some kind of filter on the data and extract it in a meaningful way. So that could be, some kind of quality criteria or so it could, yeah. So I think like there is some value to be gained from trying to make sense of all the information that is out there. Yeah, there was another thing that I wanted to say, but I kind of forgot that now. But maybe I'll come back to it later. I think it's a good discussion to continue also.
Yeah, for sure. And then maybe before we go to the panel, one more kind of technical sort of question. This was from the audience. I think that some people are chiming in about how like recycled or degradable microplastics contribute to that nice graph you showed of the plasticine development. Yeah, so when evaluating like the total content of plastics, how do those sorts of plastics end up factoring in?
So if I understand the question correctly, so like, you know, we have the fossil fuel-based plastics, but to what extent do bioplastics and recycled plastics contribute? So I mean, at present, I think bioplastics, it's very few percent of the overall plastic production that actually is made up of bioplastics. And I think even so, the numbers that I'm aware of, at least, is that even if we expect that bioplastic production will grow in the future, we will see an increase also in bioplastic production. The relative fraction of plastics compared to the total plastic production is probably likely to remain more or less the same, at least looking at the projections as they are at the moment. So both the conventional plastic production will increase and the bioplastic production will increase. For the recycled plastics, of course, the hope there is that more and more will shift from virgin plastics over to recycled plastics as well, but I'm not familiar with the exact numbers there. But I think it's around 90% of all plastics right now that are virgin plastics that come from fossil fuels.
All right, and I think the audience questions are going to be really good for our general expertise. So I think at this point, I'll also invite Amari and Philip if you want to turn your cameras on, and we can keep broadening the discussion. But yeah, thank you again, Nana, as we do, for a really beautiful talk to set this up as well. So since we're sort of talking about, you know, plastic and its abundance, maybe Amari, we could start with a question for you, also for you to kind of introduce yourself, because you've contributed, you know, not only as a chemist and an environmental engineer, but you also have a YouTube channel where you talk to the public about these issues, and you've written a book about the detection and fate of microplastics and surrounding social issues. So I'm wondering, you know, as an environmental engineer, what is it that drew you toward this topic of microplastics?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Emily, and also great talk, Dr. Hartman. So I'd say that I started on my plastic pollution journey actually in my undergraduate career, where I was studying abroad, and I started to notice a lot of plastic pollution on an island that I was doing research in. And it wasn't the main focus of my work, but it did start to kind of put, you know, kernels of ideas of, you know, disproportionate burdens of plastics to certain communities. And I also noticed they had waste management infrastructures that were different from what we commonly see. You know, leading to them having to openly burn their trash in their homes, in front of their homes. And you could smell, you know, the plastic that was being burnt, and, you know, the exposure that they were exposing themselves and their communities to. So I think those were things that started giving me inklings of the idea of, you know, how, you know, pervasive this issue is for plastic pollution and what to do with plastics. But it wasn't really until I started my PhD that I decided to move into looking at chemicals in plastics in particular. Not only can, you know, once a plastic is in the environment, it can attract other chemicals of concern to its surface and, like, you know, absorb it up like spaghetti stains on a piece of Tupperware, but also those plastics also already come with a complex mixture. And it doesn't matter if you see one bottle that says polypropylene and another one that says polypropylene, they could have totally different chemical mixtures because they come from different companies or have different purposes in mind. And so that kind of complexity and the idea that, you know, we want to try and recycle those, you know, or reuse some of those products again, makes us wonder, you know, what does that impact when you start mixing all of these different kinds of chemicals that are now contaminants of, you know, in a new form. So, you know, I think those are the things that got me into the research field. And then I'd say that as far as talking about these issues, I think the beginning of the pandemic was really what, you know, started my journey into science communication. And it gave me the opportunity to think about, like, how do we talk about this issue? Because it's more than just research, it's people's lives and, you know, things that we can all do to try and address the problem. So I think that's kind of the start to the YouTube channel and then into the book.
Yeah, that's great. And I love the through line too, from having it be about people, you know, the first time you thought of it, and now it's about people again and the communication too. And so I think transitioning into a question for Philip, is, you know, a doctor, you've had a history of working on both the research and the policy in a variety of issues that people will be familiar with, from lead paints to pesticides. And you've also been a pretty vocal part in the community of Lancet commissions and the Mindy-Romanico commission. So, how did you begin transitioning into studying plastics? And especially given your expertise, do you think that any of the alarm bells were similar to issues that you had studied before?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Emily. So I've always approached environmental hazards from the perspective of what impact might they have on human health. And because I'm trained in pediatrics, I think especially about what impacts on children's health, given that children are uniquely vulnerable to most hazards because of their patterns of exposure and their biology, early development. So there were several factors, really 3 factors, that made me start to realize 7 or 8 years ago that plastics were a much larger hazard than I had previously realized. The first thing that struck my eye is how extraordinarily rapidly plastic production is increasing globally. So it's increased roughly 200 times since the dawn of the plastic age in the 1950s. The rate of increase is accelerating. Its global production is on track right now to double by 2040 and triple by 2060. Those are astounding figures. And when you put those figures together with the report from the Stockholm Environment Institute suggesting that pollution by what they call novel entities, which includes plastic, is basically out of control. It's at the point where it threatens to cross planetary boundaries. That increase in production was the first alarm for me. The second was the recognition of all these thousands of chemicals that are in plastic. When we released the Mindy-Romanico Commission report a year ago, we said 10,500. Now this most recent report that Nana just cited indicates 16,000, and that may turn out to be an undercount again. We know that there are carcinogens in there. We know that there are neurotoxicants. We know that there are endocrine disruptors. And we know that there are thousands of chemicals that have simply never been tested for toxicity. So we don't have a clue what impact they might have on human health. And then finally, the third trigger, along with increases in production and along with chemical complexity, was the recognition of the ubiquity of the micro and nanoplastic particles in the environment, in the biosphere, but also in the human body. And a phrase that stuck in my mind as I read about the micro and nanoplastics is the phrase Trojan horse, that these little particles have the potential to act through mass action because they get into tissues and into cells, but also because they carry in them all those chemicals that are in plastic, not to speak of other items like bacteria that might adsorb to the surface. The micro and nanoplastics are very efficient vectors for bringing harmful materials into the body. And up until a month ago, that concern was sort of free floating. I was worried about all the plastics around us, the increasing burden of plastics getting in us. But then in late April, early March, when I had the chance to review the paper that was recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine, suggesting that elevated concentrations of micro and nanoparticles in the arteries of patients, cardiology patients, might be associated with increased risk of disease and death, that really rang an alarm. And for those of you who haven't seen that paper, a group in Italy, cardiologists, found that they looked at 312 patients. They looked at tissue removed from the lining of the carotid artery in the neck when people come in for surgical procedures. They found that roughly 60% of their patients had detectable micro nanoparticles in the carotid artery. And in those patients who had the detectable particles, the risk of heart attack, stroke, death was 4.5 times higher over the next 3 years than people without those particles. Well, granted, that's only one study. No study is perfect. People will always quibble with methodology. I understand that. But a 4.5-fold excess risk in mortality is not something to be lightly dismissed. And I think when you put all of this together, I think, to underscore what Nina said, this is a global problem that requires urgent action. I'm delighted that the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee is working on this, that they're meeting in about a month's time in Canada, in Ottawa. I myself and other members of the public health community are strongly pushing that a key provision of that global plastic treaty, it needs to be a global cap on plastic production. Sure, there's a million uncertainties, and we've heard a few of them this morning. But a global cap is sort of like a way to cut the Gordian knot, that even as we try to untangle all the layers of complexity that surround plastics and their possible hazards to human health and to the environment, if we continue to allow plastic production to increase exponentially, we're in big trouble. I don't think we have time to allow that to happen while we do the science. We've heard that the science is going to take years to get through. It's very complex. And this is a situation that reminds me of how I was schooled when I was a young doctor working in emergency rooms. When a patient, let's say a 9-year-old girl, comes in with pain in her belly, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning, and you're there by yourself in the emergency room, and you have to decide, is this an appendicitis and you have to operate, or is this just a bellyache and the child will be better by morning? And it's never an easy decision. The data are always incomplete, and medical doctors are trained to make life or death decisions in the face of incomplete data. I think that's what we have to do here. We don't have complete data. We will not have complete data in the foreseeable future. We of course we need to do more research, but we can't let the need for complete knowledge be a block to action.
I think that's a really interesting point, especially with how ubiquitous and how many unknowns there currently are. Maybe Nana, you could start kind of commenting on this too, because Philip has raised sort of the difference between just purely detection and then also setting thresholds. So I'm not sure if you want to sort of comment on the balance between how much do we prioritize new detection methods versus, actually setting a threshold for ecotoxicity, for example. And then, yeah, Amari, maybe you would want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. First of all, I think I really agree with what you're saying, Philip. I think we have the data that we need to call for action. So there's always some uncertainty and some unknown. So I fully agree with that. When it comes to setting thresholds for microplastics or establishing thresholds, I think that it's meaningful to set thresholds if we have like an issue that can be controlled upstream somehow. For example, when you have chemical production, industrial chemical production, if you have a kind of a way of putting a threshold on emissions, for example. But when you have a problem such as plastic pollution and especially microplastics, where you have really diffuse sources of pollution, I think thresholds becomes a little bit less meaningful in some way, at least if it's thresholds to inform regulation. So I think, of course, it's really important. I think it's key that we work on our detection methods and our sample preparation methods, is of course, especially to actually to be able to detect microplastics and nanoplastics in the environment, but also as we see like with this increasing number of studies that are showing effects on human health, that we need to understand better the exposure to the environment and to humans. But yeah, as I said, like maybe not so much because because of the need of setting limit values or thresholds, but more to understand the actual exposure.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think, you're right on it with it. I think the biggest thing is that there are some gaps for detection, like especially with nanoplastics in particular. There are new studies showing, applying machine learning techniques with Raman that I think are really great in, pushing the field forward, but not as accessible for, a lab or, a government lab to implement to say, let's look for these nanoplastics in a drinking water facility. So I think if we were to start some form of regulation, we need methods that are accessible and affordable, of course, as well, to be able to continue doing that work to actually see, yes, this is a microplastic, yes, this is a nanoplastic, this is a natural fiber or, a cotton fiber versus a synthetically made fiber. I think we've got, quite a few different things that we need to work through to make these methods accessible and for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's one of the
Sorry,
key
go on.
issues, right? Sorry, that that we have all these, like we have a lot of high tech instrumentation going on right now. We have Raman spectroscopy, we have micro focal plane array FTIR, and they're really expensive equipment, and so it's not very accessible to many people to actually have really good detection methods for microplastics. So that's also something to work on. But if I can just like add one thing, because like when we talked about this, the need to understand the mechanisms of toxicity, maybe more than setting thresholds. I think it's also because if we start to understand what are the characteristics, what are the properties of microplastics and nanoplastics that's actually causing an effect, it can also inform the design phase of the plastics, and in that way we can get better plastics. So I think we don't need more information or more knowledge to maybe say we need action to produce less plastics, but we definitely need more information and knowledge to be able to then direct the future plastic design and production if we want to make better plastics. So I think those are two different objectives.
Yeah, just to follow up on this, Nana, there's a question in the Q&A box from Fabio. He says he agrees with you on the necessity to move towards mechanistic understanding. And he's also intrigued by your point about improving standards. And he's wondering if you're aware of any attempt to create a set of reporting standards, and would this even be possible to do?
So I know that there are some articles or some papers from a few years back. I was also co-authoring one of them where we discussed the need for criteria for study for data reliability for microplastics and nanoplastics. There's also been a lot of so my original background is in nanoecotoxicology and nanomaterial toxicology, and there are frameworks for both assessing the quality and the reliability of studies, but also for like guiding a set of reporting, so some reporting recommendations for scientific studies. So there's like a foundation to build upon. I think there's still some work to be done, and it could be improved to maybe make better guidelines and guidance for researchers to make sure that all the relevant properties, for example, or experimental settings, or everything that is reported in a way that would also improve data reliability.
Yeah, I'll add a lot of those studies, focus on making sure that the plastics or the microplastics are well characterized. And, jumping back to that point, requires very expensive equipment or collaboration to get well characterized plastics from environmental samples or for benchtop, dosing for toxicity standards. And then also there's a lot of protocols in place for trying to limit contamination from within the lab as well, which can also be very expensive for certain lab groups to be able to figure out how to do.
Those are all really excellent points. And I think along with these challenges of understanding. There's also, and I think Philip kind of hinted at this too, with risks being greater in children. I think in both, the environment, plants and animals, and people, there are probably populations that are at greater risk than others. So maybe from each of your perspectives, would you like to comment on if you know that there are certain populations that are at great risk, or if there's still a lot of unknowns about where these plastics either might accumulate in that environment? Yeah, if you have any thoughts on that topic.
So let me kick that off. So we've done a lot of research going back to the 1990s, looking at pesticides at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences on the differential vulnerability of children versus adults, and children in this construct includes infants in the womb during the 9 months of pregnancy, as well as little kids after they're born. And the bottom line is that children are uniquely vulnerable to pretty much any chemical you can look at for two fundamental reasons. Firstly, on a kilogram for kilogram basis, body weight, they're more heavily exposed for the simple reason that they breathe more air, they drink more water, they eat more food, so they'll take into their bodies more of any foreign material that is in any of those media. And then the second source of vulnerability is the consequence of the unique biology of early human development. Early human development is just extraordinarily complex. Over the years I've thought particularly about brain development, and the human brain and nervous system goes from just a few cells on the dorsum of the embryo at the beginning of pregnancy to more than 1 billion cells and more than 1 trillion precisely engineered connections 9 months later by the time the baby is born. The pace of that development is incredibly rapid. The different steps have to proceed in the proper sequence, or the connections get scrambled. And the wonderful complexity of the human brain brings with it great vulnerability to a whole range of adverse environmental influences. And I think where this connects with the whole conversation on plastics, at least at the present time, concerns the chemicals in the plastics. So we know, for example, that there are chemicals in plastics that are developmental neurotoxicants, that if they get into the developing brain, things like organophosphate, flame retardants in plastics, if they get into the developing brain, they can scramble synapses and result in lifelong decreases in brain function, because brain cells have very limited capacity to repair themselves if they're damaged. And we know that some of the some of the endocrine disruptors, phthalates, for example, in addition to interfering with the development of the reproductive organs, can also interfere with brain development. We know that the brominated flame retardants reduce children's IQ, reduce executive function, result in lifelong behavioral impairment. So, and I think the exquisite vulnerability of the developing human to toxic chemicals, there's no episode that illustrates that vulnerability more starkly than the terrible tragedy that occurred 50 or 60 years ago with thalidomide, a sedative that was prescribed to women during pregnancy to suppress nausea, morning sickness. And it was found that if a woman took even 1 or 2 pills of thalidomide, as little as that, at the wrong moment in pregnancy, particularly in the early trimester, in the first weeks when the basic architecture of the human body is being laid down, that those women gave birth to babies who were missing limbs, babies that were born with no arms or no legs. The mothers were unscathed because their physiology is well established, but the rapidly developing fetus was, or at that stage embryo, was permanently damaged. So I think we have to be, when we think about the toxicology of plastics, have to be very mindful of the fact that it's not just adults who are exposed, but but infants, children, and then other vulnerable populations as well, the elderly, for example.
Thanks, Philip. Andrea, I know there are quite a few questions from humans now to oceans and fish. Do you want to summarize a couple for the panelists?
There's a really interesting question from Raj Kumar Devani from Pakistan, and he was really interested in knowing to what extent can we use data from humans where we've got really good, much better data, it's state-of-the-art medical facilities. Can we apply this to looking at, say, endangered marine mammals? How much cross species effects do you think we're likely to see in terms of plastics? Maybe Nana or Amari, do you know about anything about this?
You know, I would say uniquely, I think there's more studies on the environment, you know, for specific species of fish or, you know, endangered populations than for the human health side of things. I think human health is just starting to gain more traction in the last 4 or 5 years, but it may be
even less.
Yeah, exactly. Very small, short time frame. So it may be more so to go backwards than forward.
Right. Whereas in Naswar from Bangladesh was saying, he's asking what were some of the biggest knowledge gaps in the fish, and he's also asking about, you know, are they likely to bioaccumulate up the food chain? Do we see bioaccumulation?
For microplastics, I think we do see large quantities, or at least of microplastics or plastic pollution itself within larger species. But I think that as far as like, are we seeing different effects for different species? The answer is yes. You know, even when we're just using the example of different chemicals that are in plastics. One example is 6-PPD, an antioxidant used in tires, and that chemical transforms into 6-PPD quinone. And we know that has, you know, direct effects to coho salmon in the Pacific Northwest of, you know, America, where they're killing off that species of fish. But other studies looking at that same chemical on other freshwater fish or crustaceans don't have the same toxicity effects. So, you know, I think that, yeah, there's going to be some things that we have to do when we think about chemicals and chemical mixtures. And then even the idea of, you know, it's not just that chemical, but it's also what is it carrying with it. There are studies showing that if you expose a fish with a virus and microplastics, there's an increase in mortality events. So, you know, there's a lot of questions and, you know, not a lot of as many great answers, but we're working on it.
This is going to make toxicity testing for chemicals significantly harder than if we were able to apply things more broadly.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
How is it? You always touch this. I'm just going to jump in and ask you this question now, and some of the others might want to jump in as well. Mixture. Things that we test as chemicals, we tend to test them as individual chemicals, but we experience them in the environment as a mixture. You almost touched on this, and in conjunction with viruses and other disease. How important do you think that's going to be in our understanding of the effects of plastics more generally?
I would think in terms of human health, there's very, very little information, but I would expect that if a person, and especially a child, is exposed to multiple toxic chemicals at the same time, that there would at the very least be additive effects. Maybe not synergistic, but at least additive. It's hard to imagine that if somebody is exposed to 2 toxic chemicals that they wouldn't show toxicity from both of them.
Right.
I would say that, I mean, of course, we know that there is this huge complexity in the exposure, also in the environment, right? That, you know, as I mentioned in my talk, so not only do we have all these different polymers, we have all these different sizes of plastics, plastic litter and plastic particles. We have the chemicals in there, and then you add the environmental complexity and like the interactions with the environment, with, for example, organic matter in the environment. So there's like a whole bunch of complexity going on, and of course it's really, really challenging. How do we translate that into meaningful studies in our labs to try to get closer to understanding what the effects actually are. So I think, you know, there's this built-in dilemma or complexity when it comes to, you know, environmental relevance, and then trying to understand the mechanisms of what is actually going on. So, to understand the mechanisms, we have to isolate different parts of the system and make it less complex to understand the mechanisms. Whereas, we also, of course, want to understand what actually happens when it goes out into the environment. So there is some conflict there, you can say. But yeah, but so that's my opinion, that of course, because we have this complexity, we really need to, that's also what makes it so important for us to design our studies, to understand the mechanisms and then extrapolate from there. So I would say that we need to understand the mechanisms and then extrapolate that into more and more complexity, instead of trying to understand the complexity and then making sense of that. So that would be my take on things.
Yeah, I'll even add there's some very interesting studies that have been done on plastics used for food contact or packaging. And they studied at least 30 or 40 of those different kinds of plastics and separated them by plastic type, and then did extracts and leachates of those plastics and exposed them to cells to see baseline toxicity. And they found even within that same plastic type could have different baseline toxicities. And looking at the chemicals released into those leachates and extracts, there are sometimes hundreds to thousands, and it varies by plastic type. So, and they couldn't identify the hundreds to thousands. They just knew that there were hundreds of, to thousands in those samples. So if we go down that rabbit hole, we can still keep working on it, but
can go
it
for
take years.
Yeah.
But I think what you're saying, Amari, is also like, it's kind of linking also to this problem that we have of actually getting information about what is in the plastics, right? Because there are 10,000s of unidentified chemicals in the plastics, but it's really difficult for us as scientists to then try to do analysis and measurements and trying to understand what those chemicals are, where it would be so much easier if we could just get that information from industry. But there's some issue going on there, right?
That is exactly a question that's been asked in the Q&A box, actually. The person's asking, to what extent is it the responsibility of industry to determine and release information on the potential toxicology of their products? I believe they do this to an extent, but clearly that's probably not sufficient.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. So I mentioned earlier that I think a global cap on plastic production should be one key provision of the Global Plastics Treaty. A second key provision needs to be a legally binding requirement that the plastic producers provide much more information than they do at the present time on the toxicity. Well, first of all, on the very nature, and then secondly, on the toxicity of the chemicals that go into plastic. And I think a specific sub-requirement that needs to be added there is that every chemical that goes into plastic needs to be tested for toxicity before it goes into the plastic, and it needs to be tested by a laboratory that is not affiliated with the industry. Now, of course, the industry will say this is impossible, it's too costly, but in fact, there's a model out there, because that's precisely the model that we use before we allow prescription drugs to come to the market. If we can do it for drugs, as we've done since the thalidomide tragedy, which triggered the reform of drug toxicology, why can't we do it for industrial chemicals, including plastics chemicals?
There's also a follow-up question for Imari on the bioaccumulation issue. Charlotte is asking, could you retouch upon the question of whether microplastics bioaccumulate? That's very important, but there seems to be no clear evidence. Your answer responded more to a question on differential toxicity, is what she says.
Yeah, I think that there's still some studies being done to determine bioaccumulation. I'm not sure if I have one that's like the straight to the answer of yes, it is bioaccumulating, but did you have any, Dr. Hartman, as well?
When we brought out the Minderu Monaco report, our marine toxicologists, Mark Hahn and John Stegeman from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, we're not sure that they could say that there was true bioaccumulation in the sense that PCB bioaccumulates. But that said, they certainly detected quite high levels of microplastics in the tissues of marine species that are consumed by humans, both fin fish, like say tuna fish at the top of the food chain, but also filter feeders like oysters and mussels.
Yeah, I was also going to say that, if I believe that if you look at the actual definition of bioaccumulation, it would be that the concentration in the organism is is larger than the concentration in the surrounding media, and I'm not sure that would necessarily be the case, but we see, as you also say, Amari, we see that it's being taken up by the organisms, right? And it's there in the organism, in the tissue. So yeah.
Emily, we are reaching the end of the hour, but I think we had a couple of general questions to ask for the panelists. I mean, the plastics treaty, what people think about it, what their hopes and expectations perhaps would be one.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And I think you've all spoken at length on sort of the many unknowns that we have, which I suppose can feel a little overwhelming in making actionable change. So maybe if you want to comment generally on how, in your role as scientists, you feel that you can help to inform developments like the plastics treaty, for example, or broader communications, either from the perspective of influencing policy, for example, or just influencing awareness to the community.
So I think that what I can do as a medical scientist is direct the attention of the treaty negotiators to the known and potential risks to human health of plastics, and urge that they take those risks, known and suspected, into consideration, and have the courage to act in the face of incomplete data. I'll also mention that 2 upcoming events on the morning of April 8th and again on the morning of April 15th at 9 in the morning, US East Coast time. The Stimson Center, which is a bipartisan think tank in Washington, D.C., is going to organize 2 hour-long webinars discussing what should be the key elements in the Global Plastics Treaty. And I'm involved in those.
Interesting. So I would say, you know, advocating for, you know, chemical transparency is probably the one thing that leans towards as far as the research that I do, so we can help inform toxicology and continue these results and understand chemical complexity and their impact. I think it's the biggest thing I'd like to see.
I think from my side, I mean, as I highlighted also in my presentation, of course, as scientists, we can help to, or we can yeah, help to emphasize that there is an issue, and because we have something that we are emitting into the environment in huge amounts that is persistent, that is pervasive, and that is causing harm, we need to act. So I think that is one message that we can bring forward. The other thing that I think that is one of the aims of my research is that, you know, there will be a need for plastic in society also in the future. We cannot. It's not, I think, likely that we can stop producing plastics altogether. So it's just important that the plastic that we make, that we also make it better, and that is from a degradability point of view in some cases. It's also from a chemical point of view that you highlight, Imari. So I think also scientists, we can help to inform those that are designing the plastics and make the plastics that we actually end up using, make that better. So that is one thing. And the final thing that I wanted to mention is because plastics are so intertwined with all these other environmental issues, with climate change, with biodiversity loss. And I think especially with climate change, we also have to, from a scientific point of view, we can support that if you make substitutions for plastics, that you think about that also, that you don't make the substitutions worse from the point of view of, for example, chemicals, or from the point of view of resources and CO2 emissions. So I think there's a lot we can do as scientists to help support a lot of different processes and agendas.
And we can distinguish between the plastics that are truly essential for the running of modern society and the plastics that I call stupid.
Definitely.
The unnecessary things like trash bags.
I just also wanted to say that we've had many really excellent questions in the Q&A box, and we weren't able to ask all of them. Many of them also related to the production and design aspects of plastics, and we have the ambition to do something on that in the coming months and coming years. So keep posted for that. Emily, do you want to sum up?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this has just been a really wonderful discussion. We'll certainly also keep track of all of the questions that have come in that we haven't had a chance to answer. But yeah, we just so appreciate having these three perspectives coming together. I think that you all have raised a lot of interesting points for people to think about. But also I think a lot of hopefulness in terms of answering some of these big gaps and unknowns, and the type of researchers who are having action on these policies and informing the plastics treaty. So yeah, I think that those are my summary thoughts, and I've certainly learned a ton just from the brief discussion today.
Fantastic. Thanks. And I'm sure all the organizers and the audience agrees with what you say, Emily.
Thank you very much for organizing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Thanks very much.
Thanks
Take
a
care.
lot. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.